Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Zara Seidler.
I'm Sam Koslowski.
Over the weekend, you might have known that there was a federal election here in Australia.
Was there, Zara?
I know. At that election, you might also know that Labor won a significant majority, while the coalition had their standing in Parliament weakened considerably. Now, whilst most of the media's attention has been on how the major parties fared, in today's podcast, we're going to shift focus a bit and talk about the biggest minor party in Australia's Parliament, the Greens, and what their results looked like over the weekend.
Before we jump into how the Greens did this year, Zara, I think it's so helpful to look at a bit of a context of where they've come from, because there's been a lot of chat about the Greens in the Parliament that's just been.
Yeah.
Give me a sense of the last term
in
terms of how the Greens were placed in Australian politics.
Yeah, I agree. That is a good place to start, because I guess what you end the last term of Parliament with is what you enter the election season with. So let's just break it down quickly. Basically, what you need to know is that the Greens had a really good election in 2022. They labelled their success at that election as a green slide, and that language was kind of picked up. I think we probably used it as well on election night in 2022. And that was because at that election, they won the seats of Brisbane and Ryan from the Coalition and the seat of Griffith from Labor. So they grew quite significantly at that last election in the House of Representatives.
Do you think we should agree that politics should introduce some more creative, describing words than green slide, teal wave, Labor landslide? Like, there's a lot of just movement of earth going on.
Lots of movement of earth. I've never actually thought about that. Anyway, maybe we can have a whole podcast dedicated to ideas for how to talk about parties and how they fare at elections.
It's new media.
So basically, again, as I said, really good election in 2022, 4 seats in the House of Representatives. And then when we moved to the Senate at the 2022 election, the Greens ended up with 12 senators, and that was particularly significant at the time because while Labor had a majority of seats in the lower house, they still needed support from the Greens and the crossbench in the upper house in order to pass contentious legislation. And so the Greens had quite a major role in the last Parliament when it came to either helping or hindering Labor with their policy outcomes. The Greens did, I will just say, lose a senator in Lydia Thorpe. You might remember that she left the Greens and went to sit on the crossbench. And so they came into this election with 11 senators and with 4 House of Representative MPs.
And leading up to the election, the party's leader, Adam Bandt, he was saying that the goal for the Greens was 9 seats in 2025. And so that's, they were really enthused by where they were and where they were going this election.
Yeah.
But talk to me about how they placed themselves in the lead up to the election in terms of their key message to voters and their aspirations.
Yeah. So on a policy front, I think it's difficult to, pick out a main one because the Greens went to the election with a kind of scattergun of different policies that were trying to persuade voters across the country, like both of the major parties did. I'd say the one that randomly stood out to me because it was pushed a lot on social media was their policy to expand Medicare to include dental. Anyone who has TikTok would have seen the videos and photos of Adam Bandt surrounded by influencers holding these huge life-size toothbrushes, and that was part of selling this policy around dental being included in Medicare. They also went to the election, and Billy and I have spoken about this at length, but they went to the election calling for university and TAFE to be completely free, for all student debt to be wiped. They wanted no new coal and gas mines to be built. They wanted 50-cent public transport fees across the country. And they also spent quite a lot of time, especially in some of those key seats, campaigning around the war in Gaza, and that became quite a hallmark of their campaign. Just in terms of, zooming out a bit and thinking about what their campaign looked like from the outside, I think one thing that was really notable was their inclusion of influencers. Yeah. Traditional media has spent weeks and months talking about this, so I don't want to talk about it too much, but I do think that it's significant how many influencers and content creators they had doing content for them on socials, doing events for them. We saw Abby Chatfield hosting events with Adam Bandt DJing. Yeah. This was an election where the Greens were really leaning into new media and influencers. I'd say unlike any other election season that I've seen.
And so that's some of the context that built up to Saturday's vote.
Yeah.
Then Australians go to the polls.
Yeah.
How did the Greens go?
I think the answer is basically that it was a mixed bag for the Greens. The TLDR is that they did badly in the House of Representatives.
So the lower house.
In the lower house, yep. And then they did better in the Senate. We'll start with the House first because, as we've mentioned before, that is where government is formed. So according to the Australian Electoral Commission's results, the Greens' vote for the lower house declined by 0.5% nationally, and at the time of recording, they haven't secured a single seat in the House. They've already conceded 2 seats, the seats of Griffith and Brisbane, while Melbourne and Ryan haven't been confirmed yet.
So best case scenario, they win 2 seats.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And when it comes to explaining why the Greens have struggled to retain their seats, because the two MPs that lost their seats have done a bit of this explaining or tried to do a bit of this explaining, it is obviously impossible to give one reason. You know, no one voter turns out differently to another voter for any single reason. But I do think that a big thing that's being spoken about based on the vote counts is that low support for the Liberal Party has actually hurt the Greens.
Which is a complicated idea. And
So
it
complicated.
doesn't actually make
It's
much sense.
counterintuitive. Yeah.
But it does go to a system where there's 2 major parties and that can affect the Greens. Spell that out for me, though, a little bit more.
Hello, Billy here from TDA. We have just looked at our YouTube analytics and 95% of you who are watching our videos aren't subscribing. If you want to help independent media like us grow, the best way you can do that is by pressing subscribe. Thank you so much, and back to the video.
Yeah, I mean, you're totally right. Logically thinking, you'd expect that if the Liberal Party's vote tanked, that would be a good thing for the Greens because they're on either sides of the political spectrum. But that's not what's happened, as you just said, because of our preferential voting system. So let me just unpack it. When it comes to the lower house seats like Griffith or Brisbane, the Greens are mostly locked in 3-cornered races with Labor and the Liberal Party. And so broadly speaking, each of the 3 parties receives about 1/3 of the votes in those seats. Under the preferential system, the candidate that finishes 3rd will have their preferences flow to the final 2 contenders.
Got it.
Makes sense?
We're
okay.
here.
You didn't speak, so I wasn't sure if you understand.
No, I'm here.
So, yeah, 1, 2, 3,
Yeah.
and then the 3rd person, they're out and their preferences flow upwards. And so if we take the seat of Griffith, for example, the Liberal Party ended in 3rd place there. And then what happened was the Liberals' preferences flowed to Labor more than they flowed to the Greens, which meant that Labor was able to win the seat overall based on the preferences that actually came from the Liberal Party.
And that's a really interesting new dynamic to some of these seats that had, you know, for the first time just elected a Greens representative.
Yeah.
With almost a 2-horse race. Now it became more of a 3-horse race, and a combination of Liberal and Labor preferences overcame 2 of those seats, particularly in Queensland. One seat that everyone's been talking about, though, in particular, is the seat of Melbourne.
Yeah.
And that's the seat that was currently held by Adam Bandt. He is the leader of the Greens.
Yeah.
What's happening there?
Yeah, so it does need to be said that numbers are changing all the time. And I feel like every time I say something on the podcast, a minute later it changes and suddenly we're out of date. But we will just say, we'll break the 4th wall by saying this is what we understand at the time of recording. So right now, the seat of Melbourne is too close to call, and nobody, not Anthony Green, not the AEC, no one has called the seat of Melbourne. What we do know is that there has been a significant swing away from Adam Bandt and away from the Greens in that seat that he has held since 2010.
Yeah.
So we understand there's been a 4% swing away from him, and that he previously held the seat with a 6.5% margin. So what the AEC is currently doing is they're tallying a 2-candidate preferred preference count between Adam Bandt and between Labor's candidate. And so that's what's taking so long, is that process is currently underway. And right now, no one feels comfortable making a call either way. I will add, just because he is kind of the gospel when it comes to these things, that the ABC's chief election analyst, Anthony Green, has predicted that Adam Bandt will hold on to his seat. You've got 20 people saying 20 different things here.
Yeah, and as we've said on the pod, but also over on our socials, this week is also characterised by, counting of postal votes and counting of some of the absentee ballots and some of the more manual, slower parts of the count where in particularly tight races, they really do need to go and count every single vote, a couple of times to make sure it's all legit.
Well, I think one of the interesting questions that's come back time and time again when I ask our audience for questions are that people don't know that it's a manual process and that there is like a human element to all of this. We don't have computers counting everything. And so it takes time, and people are very eager to understand the full results and the full composition of the House. But right now, we can't tell you that.
So it's a little bit of a deflating result for the Greens in the lower house. But let's talk about perhaps some better news for the party in the upper house.
Yeah, so in the upper house, the Greens are on track to retain all 11 senators. I'll just put a caveat there. Not all 11 were up for re-election. Remember that only half the Senate, except for the territories, super confusing, but only half the Senate is up for re-election at this election. But the Greens are on track to maintain the 11 that they went in with. And in the states of New South Wales, South Australia and Tasmania, the Greens recorded a swing towards them. So a positive swing, which means more people were voting for them. Now, as you would understand, given the results in the House, perhaps not being what the Greens were hoping, Adam Bandt, as leader, has been really focusing on their results in the upper house and what it means. And so he's said that they will retain the balance of power in the Senate. And I just want to unpack what that means
exactly
for a second.
Mean?
Yeah, so right now it looks like the government, so Labor, will only need the Greens in order to pass legislation. So as I said, last Parliament, Labor didn't have enough seats to pass things through that were contentious by themselves. They needed the Greens, but then they also needed a number of crossbenchers, other crossbenchers, I should say. What we're saying now is that Labor has actually increased the number of seats they have in the Senate. So now they only rely on the Greens, which in a kind of backwards way means that the Greens hold a lot more power in the Senate this time around, or that's what Adam Bandt is saying. So he's trying to highlight the fact that the Greens can reject or approve certain pieces of legislation and, as I said, either help or hinder the government when it comes to their legislative agenda there. But again, and I know that this caveat is so boring, counting continues. Things change. We don't know the overall composition of the House. We don't know the overall composition of the Senate. What we do know, though, is that the Greens perhaps did not end up with the results that they were wanting at this election. And just like the Liberal Party will be doing a bit of soul searching, it'll be interesting to understand what the Greens see as the takeaways from the results at Saturday's election.
It was interesting to hear some of the comments made by Max Chandler-Mather, who lost his seat of Griffith. He was talking to Triple J's Dave Marchese yesterday for his first kind of statement after losing a seat, which is a pretty traumatic thing to go through. And he spoke about the emotional side of that. But one thing he said when he was asked about the reasons why and why people, perhaps in his seat in particular, turned away from the Greens, he answered with that two-party phenomenon that you were talking about before, that when the Labor Party and Liberal Party combined in their preferences and the preference flows and in the way that they both, the one thing they agreed on was how much they didn't want the Greens to win, that was almost too much to overcome for him. And it's a really interesting aspect of our political system. We get so caught up in the Liberal versus Labor battles that there's some really interesting patterns emerging in some of the minor parties as well.
Yeah, definitely. One to keep an eye on. And certainly once more of those seats are called, we will be sure to update listeners.
And thank you so much for that, Zara. And thank you for joining us on TDA. Oh my gosh, what a couple of weeks of journalism it's been for us. We're so excited by what we've been able to achieve in covering the 2025 federal election. But we still have lots of work to do. We have a new parliament to cover. And the best way that you can help us is by supporting us, by following this podcast, by sending it to a friend, putting it in the group chat. It all makes a big difference. We'll speak to you in the afternoon with some headlines.